Welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hello, my dear audience. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And of course, you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Goodpods, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza, and I have an email address which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So either via social media or via email, you can reach out with any suggestions, any feedback. Those are always welcome and appreciated. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. Thank you so much for the support. And as you know, the Let's Talk Micro podcast does not have any sponsors, and I'm always looking for great content, and sometimes I have to go to conferences. So if you want to support the podcast in any way, you can do so via a Venmo link or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, both links available on the show notes. And of course, if you are looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. Great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. Okay, and as always, if you haven't checked out the previous episode, please go ahead and do so. It was an episode about lactobacillus, so it was one of those episodes where I talk about an organism. So I continued going over gram-positive rods, so this time I went over lactobacillus. And as you remember by now, I have done Corynebacterium, Bacillus, Listeria, and I also talked about Actinotignum shallii. And lactobacillus is a catalase negative gram-positive rod. If you go to the textbooks, it is grouped with the anaerobes, but the organism is air tolerant, so you were able to see it growing aerobically. And you definitely see it in urine cultures, and I talk about how it is part of the urogenital flora of females. And I also went over biochemicals, media, morphology, all the usual things that I go over when I talk about organisms. And one thing that, since if you work with urine cultures, maybe you might dismiss it a lot of times as urogenital flora, but I went over some guidelines from the American Society for Microbiology that in urine cultures, when you have pure and significant growth, it needs to be reported at least as lactobacillus species. And I also talked about this pure and significant growth thing and the criteria for it in the Actinotignum shallii episode. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to today's episode, which is about a joint infections panel for the BioFire system. Those of you that work in the lab, I'm sure that a lot of you that work in micro, you're familiar with this instrument that is very convenient because you can do like meningitis panels, you can run gastrointestinal panels, you can run respiratory panels. And in this case, a joint infections panel was evaluated. And in this episode, I have two guests, which are Angelica Moran, and she's a clinical microbiologist at the University of Chicago. And I also have Jekzaly Arellano. And Jekzaly is she's an MLS, and then she's a PhD candidate at Rush University. So they joined the podcast to talk about an evaluation they did on this joint infections panel. So they went over all the components of the study. They talked about the sample types, which are joint fluids. They talked about the procedure, the results, the discrepancies, and of course how these results compare to the golden standard, which is the culture. And in the episode, they talk about why is it challenging to diagnose joint infections. And one thing that was very interesting was that when they were talking about the results, and one of the discrepancies they had was they had a sample that they ran this panel and they detected strep. However, the culture was negative. And looking at the patient's history, they saw that a sample was collected 3 days later and that sample grew Streptococcus mitis. So this shows that potentially this panel might be more sensitive. But all in all, a great episode, very informative. So let's go ahead and listen to it. So those of you that work in the lab, and you work in microbiology or maybe virology, depending on how big your place is, some of you might have worked with the BioFire
instrument, and there's plenty of tests. There's like a GI panel test. There's like the COVID test, respiratory panel. So today we're here to talk about an evaluation of a joint infections panel. And with me today, I have two guests. I have Angelica Moran and Jekzaly Arellano. Angelica, Jekzaly, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Thank you for having us here today. My name is Angelica Moran. I am a clinical microbiologist at the University of Chicago and also a researcher with the Jekzaly Family Institute, where I help develop clinical tests for evaluating the gut microbiome.
Yes, thank you for having us. My name is Jekzaly. So I was a medical laboratory scientist when I was working on this project with Dr. Moran at North Shore University Health System under the direction of Dr. McElvania. But currently, I am a third-year PhD candidate at Rush University in the laboratory of Dr. Lina El-Harthi. She's a well-known researcher in the area of HIV, but she also studies COVID and Zika. And so my project and my doctoral research involves studying long COVID and understanding potential mechanisms that may be driving neurological manifestations that we see in patients like brain fog, headache, memory loss, etc. And I decided to pursue my PhD because eventually I want to become a clinical microbiology laboratory director myself. And as we know, getting into CPET fellowship, you need either an MD or PhD. So I decided during becoming a med tech that I wanted to pursue my PhD, and Dr. McElvania has been a huge mentor in guiding me through this process.
That is great. Thank you so much again for taking the giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And so you're gonna stay in the lab, but then just a little bit different role eventually, just be like a director. So you're gonna get a lot of questions your way. Okay, so as I was reading, and for the audience, I'm gonna go ahead and put the link to the study on the show notes so they can see it and read it. But as I was reading, right, so diagnosing joint infections is challenging, right? So why is that?
Well, many diseases like gout and rheumatoid arthritis can have very similar symptoms to joint infections. Most people have pain, swelling, and somewhat limited range of motion for all of these diseases. So physicians need reliable tests to help them decide, is the patient's joint infected or not? We can order a synovial fluid analysis. This includes white blood cell counts, neutrophil percent, crystal examination, and stains for microbes. But generally, there's few numbers of bacteria, and people with prosthetic joints may not have the high neutrophil counts that you typically see with bacterial joint infections. People have started testing for inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein or alpha defensin directly on the joint fluid, but these are also not specific to joint infections. Ultimately, we want to identify whether microbes are present and are they causing their symptoms. So we need to culture the joint fluid.
It's also challenging, I could say, from a perspective of a medical lab scientist, because many times the organisms that we see in the joint infections are fastidious or hard to grow. So we often see patients presenting with 4+ WBCs and a gram stain and no organism seen. So it becomes a waiting game for these patients, even though they are getting empirically treated. It is important to ID the organism as soon as possible. Another challenge that we see is if an organism doesn't grow, or if it does grow, it takes a really long time, and that does affect patient outcomes. And additionally, the way the sample is collected can affect the results that we see. But most importantly, to answer your question, it just takes a really long time to get the results. And, sometimes do we even recover the organism at all, since we know culture is the current gold standard?
Yes, definitely. You also mentioned in the article that metagenomic sequencing suggests that some cases are being missed. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. As Jekzaly mentioned, it can be hard to culture the organisms from joint fluids. Metagenomic shotgun sequencing is a technique where all of the nucleic acids that are present in a specimen are sequenced using next generation sequencing. This lets us detect and identify all the microbes, whether or not it will grow on routine culture media. There have been many studies that are published now where researchers have sequenced joint fluids from patients who have clinical symptoms or a clinical history that is highly suggestive for infection, but their cultures may not reflect that. If you look specifically at patients with prosthetic joints, They have seen that metagenomic sequencing can detect organisms in up to 25% of culture negative specimens. So, of course, some of these might be contaminants that sequencing picked up, but they can also be real infections due to organisms that they were just present at low numbers. However, not many microbiology labs have the ability to do next-gen sequencing. And sequencing is very, very expensive. So some of us have started to search for other, more targeted PCR-based methods.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking also from the perspective of a medical lab scientist as well that, yeah, a lot of those cultures that we see, a lot of times, might be with maybe the organisms do not grow or things like that, but, where we keep them for like 14 days, and a lot of times, a lot of them tend to be negative, as you were seeing. So that might have something to do with maybe them not growing or things like that. Um, so let's go ahead and just take it from the beginning. I mentioned that we're going to be talking about this panel. So let's talk about what was the purpose of this study.
So the purpose of this study was that we wanted to evaluate the performance of the BioFire JI panel for detecting joint infections compared to routine culture because it's nice about the BioFire panel is it only takes an hour to provide a result.
Yeah, it's definitely a very convenient, system where you can run multiple, depending on the setup that you have. Like as I mentioned before, you can sometimes, run a respiratory, you can do a GI, you can do like a meningitis encephalitis panel. So it's a very convenient system. It's very, very helpful in the lab. So let's go ahead and talk about the study. Maybe can you talk about, the samples that you selected and expand on the procedure?
Yeah, of course. So we selected joint fluid samples from our hospital, North Shore University Health System, now named Endeavor Health, and we that were received for bacterial culture. We had both fresh samples and frozen samples. The frozen samples went far as back as 2018 for a total of 167 specimens. For the frozen samples, we chose ones based on the result so that we can get test a variety of organisms. And the fresh samples were just consecutive samples that we got in the lab, regardless of the result. And they were run within 1 week of collection. Dr. Moran was blinded to the results when she was running them. So specifically for the 63 frozen specimens that we chose, 14 were from patients with prosthetic joints, 48 from native joints, and one of the status of the specimens was unknown. To look for positive specimens and specimens with high levels of joint inflammation, frozen joint fluid specimens were selected based on routine culture and gram stain results. And then the 28 cultured positive specimens group gram positive or gram negative, and that are targets on the BioFire GI panel. And then the 35 culture negative specimens included joint fluids with leukocytes or organisms on the gram stain, or cultures that grew organisms but are not targets on the JI panel. And then the 104 fresh specimens, prospective specimens included 17 samples from patients with prosthetic joints and 87 native joint specimens. And 14 organisms were isolated in routine culture from 12 specimens in total, meaning some of the joint fluids had more than one organism that grew. And then these included 4 bacterial specimens, which can be detected by the JI panel, but about half of the positive cultures had organisms that are not on the panel. And then the procedure, basically, all of them had cultures by routine methods, which meant they got a gram stain reported, and then they were inoculated in regular media, so blood, chocolate, McConkey, CNA, anaerobic CNA, and Brucella plates. And then 10 mils of the synovial fluid were inoculated in a blood culture bottle, which was put in a Bactec system. And then when we used 200 microliters of the leftover fluid to run the JI pouch on the BioFire torch instrument. And then if any joint fluid remained, we would freeze that in case we needed to do additional testing. And then we compared the results from the BioFire panel to our normal culture results.
And it has been a long time since I worked with it. I used to in another institution, but the torch is the one that's the tower, right? That it's like you have like multiple, or because there's also like some that you come like the individual units, but then the torch is the one that
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a tower. We had 2 modules, so you can run 2 at a time, but there's definitely ones where you can put 4 or 8 or 12.
Got it. Okay, so and then so how did the panel perform against the cultures?
It actually did pretty well. So for the frozen specimens, the GI panel result matched a culture result in 92.8% of positive cultures and 97.1% of negative cultures. But for the fresh specimens, it was a little bit lower. So the sensitivity of the BioFire panel was only 71%, but the specificity was still good, so 94.8%. Altogether, we saw a total of 12 discrepancies amongst the 167 specimens that we tested. So, how did we decide, well, with these discrepancies, which one was the true result? Well, we had a process for trying to determine that. We first repeated the BioFire panel for all the discrepant samples when there was enough sample left. We also sent them to Mayo Clinic labs for 16S ribosomal RNA sequencing. I also reviewed any other lab testing or culture results from these patients. We decided to follow a stepwise criteria to decide, should the culture result or the BioFire panel result be considered the more accurate one. So first, if there were any other positive cultures collected within 1 week of the specimen that we tested, we considered that also to be a true result. For example, there was one case where the BioFire panel detected Streptococcus species, even though the culture result was originally negative. But when we did a look back for that patient, there was another joint fluid specimen that was collected 3 days later, and that one actually grew strep mitis group. So in this particular situation, the PCR panel would have caught the infection 3 days earlier than routine culture. We believed the BioFire result in this case. And then our next criteria was just using Mayo's sequencing result as a tiebreaker. So if culture matched the sequencing result, then we favored culture. If the JI panel matched the sequencing result, then we favored the JI panel. Now, this was actually kind of interesting. There were negative cultures matching negative sequencing results. And in most of these cases, the BioFire detected a staph species. So you can imagine these might be contaminants, false positives. You might see that even on routine culture, right? But when we repeated the BioFire panel, the panel result was negative. So we believe that these patients truly had no infection and that the initial BioFire result were false positives. And then finally, we had one specimen where we didn't have enough sample left to rerun the BioFire or to send for sequencing, so we couldn't resolve that. So to basically sum all of that up, we ended up favoring the BioFire result for 6 discrepancies. We favored the routine culture result for 5 discrepancies, and we weren't able to resolve one of the 12 discrepancies.
That's so interesting that it was so sensitive with that strep mitis that maybe even originally wasn't being on that sample 3 days earlier, it wasn't being
Seen in a culture, but yet it was detected.
that's amazing how sensitive that was in that case. So with anything, right? With any when you're doing any study or something, sometimes they work well, sometimes some things don't. We get challenges. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, so the BioFire pouch was pretty easy to use, and after you put it in the instrument, you can walk away and it gives you results in 1 hour. Sometimes the joint fluids were a little viscous, but otherwise there were no issues for the actual testing. It does require having at least 200 microliters of a sample, which we didn't have for some of the patients.
Okay. Yeah, when as I mentioned, with this system, I think the only thing for me that I don't like of the BioFire is the aluminum cans that come with the test. That's those depending on how much testing you do, they pile up real quick. So that's the only thing. But other than that, it's a really good system, I think. Um, as far as anything else, like any limitations to the study or anything like that?
For limitations, we had a limited number of positive specimens, and our collection didn't include all of the organisms that could theoretically be detected by the panel. So we couldn't comprehensively assess clinical benefits of having these results because we anonymized our samples and couldn't get additional patient information in real time. Lastly, we only had samples from our own institution, but our system has a specialized orthopedic hospital, so we do feel like we had a representative patient population where this test could be useful.
And this just make me think real quick. So is it, and I'm gonna ask your conclusions in a minute, but as far as, so maybe are you planning like in the future to do another study or maybe incorporating this or what, anything in the future for this panel?
Um, I think that, I'm currently at the University of Chicago. We have a very different patient population. We don't have an orthopedic hospital, so we would be considering doing a small study before we were to implement something like this.
All right, thank you. So from this study, what do you conclude?
I would say that the BioFire JI panel is a nice molecular assay that can be an additional tool for diagnosing joint infections. We definitely do not advocate replacing routine culture because there are some important pathogens that cause joint infections that are not on the panel. The biggest one being Cutibacterium acnes. But I do think this test can provide useful information very quickly if you use it with culture. The fast turnaround of time of 1 hour can have an impact when the panel does detect common resistance genes like MEK-A or CTXM. If these are present, that would be a clue to the physician, okay, for empiric antibiotics, while you're waiting for a culture result, don't use, X, Y, and Z.
Okay. Yeah, I think from a lab perspective, I think a lot of times, the challenge when you have, like PCR panels and then you run them with cultures, it's the challenge that we have as med lab scientists, is them not matching. That sometimes, they do create a lot of work because you're like, okay, maybe I need to reset the sample, maybe I need to add media. And then after you go through all these steps, maybe any limitations. And sometimes, you're working these things 4 or 5 days and eventually, yeah, it's not there, it's not growing. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It's just like it's not growing on your culture, but it can be challenging for us. But still, I can definitely see the advantage for the patient and having that result ahead of time because, as we mentioned, these things can take days. So it's definitely beneficial for the patient, which is the most important thing. So, is there anything else that you want to add before we conclude the episode?
Unlike many of the other papers that have been published on this JI panel, our study was not funded by the manufacturing company. So I like to say that we're completely unbiased. Um, like I said, based on these results, Endeavor Health has already implemented this test, whereas University of Chicago is considering adding it to our menu because at least we are not aware of any other commercially available PCR-based panels for detecting joint infections at this time.
And that's all we have. Thank you for having us on the podcast.
Well, it definitely has been very informative, and I always, like reading things like this, and when I saw this about this panel, it seemed very interesting. So once again, thank you for taking the time to be in Let's Talk Micro.
Thank you very much.
And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about this panel for joint infections. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much for the downloads. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy sharing this information with you. And also, please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. Thank you. So as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.